Ed Sullivan sat in a dark corner booth at Patsy's Italian restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, watching two men in expensive suits walk through the door. It was November 1959, and Ed had been sitting in that booth for 20 minutes, waiting for a meeting he'd been told very clearly not to take. The two men weren't Frank Sinatra's managers. They weren't his lawyers. They were what people in New York whispered about but never said out loud: made men connected. And they had a message for Ed Sullivan about his upcoming booking of Frank Sinatra. A message that Ed's own security team had begged him not to hear in person. But Ed Sullivan hadn't built his show by being afraid, and he wasn't going to start now. The taller of the two men slid into the booth across from Ed. His voice was soft, almost friendly. "Mr. Sullivan, we appreciate you taking this meeting. We have some concerns about how you're planning to present Frank on your show next month." Ed looked at the man without blinking. "I don't discuss my show's content with anyone except my producers in CBS." The man smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Mr. Sullivan, Frank Sinatra is a friend of ours, a very close friend, and we need to make sure that when he appears on your show, certain questions don't get asked. Certain topics don't get mentioned. You understand what we're saying? Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when Ed Sullivan discovered that booking the biggest star in America meant dealing with the most dangerous men in the country, and had to choose between his integrity and his life. To understand why Frank Sinatra's Mafia connections were such a crisis for Ed Sullivan, you need to understand what everyone in the entertainment industry knew in 1959, but nobody was allowed to say publicly. Frank Sinatra was connected to organized crime in ways that went far beyond casual friendship. His career had been built, maintained, and protected by men whose names appeared in FBI files, whose business interests included gambling, extortion, and worse. The connection went back to Sinatra's early days in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he'd grown up in a neighborhood controlled by Italian organized crime families. As his singing career had taken off in the 1940s, Sinatra had cultivated relationships with powerful mob figures. Willie Moretti, a capo in the Genovese crime family, had allegedly helped Sinatra get out of an early contract with Tommy Dorsey's band by making an offer that couldn't be refused. Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss, had helped finance Sinatra's Las Vegas casino investments. By 1959, these weren't rumors anymore. They were documented facts that the FBI had been building into a file that was growing thicker every year. J. Edgar Hoover's agents had photographed Sinatra entering and leaving the homes of known mobsters. They had wiretaps of conversations where Sinatra was discussed as an asset, a friend, someone useful to the families. Ed Sullivan knew all of this because everyone in entertainment knew it. But there was an unspoken agreement. You didn't talk about it. You didn't ask questions. You booked Frank Sinatra on your show. You let him sing. You thanked him. And you never ever mentioned the words organized crime or mafia in the same breath as his name. But Ed Sullivan had a problem. His producers at CBS had been approached by a journalist who was working on an expose about Sinatra's mob ties. The journalist wanted to know if Ed would be willing to ask Sinatra about these connections during his upcoming appearance. Not aggressively, just acknowledge that questions existed and give Sinatra a chance to address them. CBS's legal department had exploded at the suggestion. Absolutely not. We cannot put Ed Sullivan in that position. Sinatra will walk off the show. His lawyers will sue us. And worse, his friends might take action that has nothing to do with lawsuits. But Ed had been intrigued by the idea. Not because he wanted to ambush Sinatra, but because he genuinely believed that if the connections existed and were documented, ignoring them was a form of dishonesty to his audience. He'd told CBS he wanted to think about it. And that's when the phone calls had started. First, polite calls from Sinatra's management team suggesting that any questions about Frank's personal life would be inappropriate. Then, less polite calls from people who identified themselves as friends of Frank's explaining that certain topics were off-limits. And finally, a call that had been routed through 3 different numbers before reaching Ed's private line. A voice he didn't recognize had simply said, "Mr. Sullivan, you should meet with some people who want to explain things to you. Patsy's restaurant, tomorrow at 8 p.m., come alone." Ed's head of security had been emphatic when Ed told him about the meeting. "Ed, you cannot go to that meeting. These are not people you negotiate with. These are people who make problems disappear. And if you become a problem, they will make you disappear too." But Ed had gone anyway, because Ed Sullivan's entire career had been built on the principle that nobody, not sponsors, not network executives, not politicians, told him how to run his show. And he wasn't going to let organized crime start now. The man across from Ed in the booth at Patsy's introduced himself only as a friend of Frank's. He explained, very calmly and very clearly, that Frank Sinatra was a national treasure, that he brought joy to millions of Americans, that his personal friendships were nobody's business, and that any attempt to bring up those friendships on the Ed Sullivan Show would be seen as a hostile act, not just against Frank, against his friends. "Are you threatening me?" Ed asked directly. The man looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Mr. Sullivan, we're not threatening you. We're explaining reality to you. Frank is going to appear on your show. You're going to introduce him. He's going to sing. You're going to thank him. And that's all that's going to happen. Because anything else would be bad for Frank, bad for you, bad for your family, bad for everyone involved." The mention of Ed's family made something cold settle in Ed's stomach, but his voice stayed steady. "I decide what happens on my show. Not you, not Frank Sinatra, not anyone else." The man sighed, like he was disappointed but not surprised. "Mr. Sullivan, you're a smart man. Smart enough to know that some battles aren't worth fighting. Frank Sinatra has friends who make sure he doesn't have problems. If you become a problem, those friends will make sure you stop being a problem, and we both know what that means." Ed stood up from the booth. "Gentlemen, I appreciate you taking the time to explain your position. Now let me explain mine. I've been doing my show for 11 years. In that time, presidents have tried to tell me who to book. Sponsors have tried to tell me what to say. The network has tried to control my content. I've said no to all of them. What makes you think I'm going to say yes to you?" The second man, who hadn't spoken until now, finally spoke. His voice was like gravel. "Because we're not asking, Mr. Sullivan. We're informing." Ed walked out of Patsy's restaurant and into a car where his security team was waiting. They drove him home in silence. And when Ed walked into his apartment, his wife Sylvia was waiting with a worried expression. "Ed, a man called the house. He said he was a friend. He said he wanted to make sure our daughter Betty was safe at college. He said there's a lot of dangerous people in the world, and we should be careful." Ed sat down heavily. For the first time in his career, he understood that he wasn't just dealing with professional consequences. He was dealing with men who could hurt his family, men who had hurt other people's families, men who saw intimidation and violence as normal business practices. The next morning, Ed called an emergency meeting with CBS executives. He told them about the meeting at Patsy's, about the veiled threats, about the call to his home. CBS's head of programming went white. "Ed, you need to cancel the Sinatra booking. Right now, we can't put you in this position." But Ed shook his head. "If I cancel Sinatra because mobsters threatened me, they win. They learn that threatening me works. And I'll never have control of my show again because everyone will know that all they have to do is threaten me, and I'll fold." "So what do you want to do?" the CBS executive asked. Ed's answer was simple. "I want to do exactly what they told me not to do. I want to book Sinatra, let him perform, and then I want to ask him one question about his friendships. One question. To prove that nobody controls what gets said on my show except me." The CBS legal team exploded. The network brass tried to overrule Ed. His own producers begged him to reconsider. But Ed was unmovable. Frank Sinatra would appear on the show, and Ed would ask his question. And whatever happened after that would happen. December 13th, 1959. Frank Sinatra appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show to perform High Hopes, his current hit. The performance was flawless, professional, exactly what America expected from Frank Sinatra. When the song ended, Ed walked over to shake Frank's hand and thank him. And then Ed did something that made everyone in the control booth hold their breath. He looked at Frank and said, "Frank, there's been a lot of talk in the press lately about your friendships with various businessmen. Do you want to address any of that?" The studio went silent. Frank Sinatra's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very cold. "Ed, I have a lot of friends. I choose my friends based on their character, not their profession. And I don't apologize for being loyal to people who've been loyal to me." It was a non-answer that acknowledged nothing and admitted nothing. But it was on the record. Ed had asked the question. Frank had answered. And now America had heard it. The moment the show ended, Frank Sinatra walked off stage without speaking to Ed. His management team followed him out of the building. And Ed's security team immediately surrounded Ed with instructions to get him out of the studio and somewhere safe. The next day, Ed received a phone call at his office. The same voice from before, the one that had set up the meeting at Patsy's. "Mr. Sullivan, you made a mistake last night. A serious mistake. We told you what would happen if you didn't listen." Ed's voice was steady. "Are you threatening me?" The voice on the other end laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "We're way past threatening, Mr. Sullivan." "Alf." For the next 6 months, Ed Sullivan lived with security. Real security, not just for show. Armed men who checked his car before he got in it. Guards who walked his daughter to class at college. CBS hired a firm that specialized in protecting people from organized crime. And nothing happened. No violence, no accidents, no mysterious incidents. Ed and his family remained safe. And slowly, very slowly, Ed realized why. Because Sam Giancana and the other mob bosses had made a calculation. Killing or hurting Ed Sullivan would bring more attention to their connection to Sinatra than Ed's one question ever could. It would make Ed a martyr. It would trigger federal investigations. It would be ironically bad for business. Ed had won the battle by understanding something that the mobsters understood too. Sometimes the threat is more powerful than the action. If they'd hurt Ed, they would have proved that Sinatra's mob connections were real and dangerous. By leaving him alone, they could maintain the pretense that it was all rumors and paranoia. Frank Sinatra never appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show again. Not because Ed banned him, but because Frank refused to return. The relationship between them remained cold and professional from a distance. Frank never publicly discussed the incident. Neither did Ed. But years later, in 1971, after Ed Sullivan had retired, he gave an interview where he was asked about his biggest regrets. "I regret asking Frank Sinatra that question," Ed said. "Not because I was wrong to ask it, but because it put my family in danger, and no question is worth that. I proved my point, but the cost of proving it was almost too high." Frank Sinatra died in 1998. In his later years, he gave several interviews where he was asked about his mob connections. He always gave the same answer he'd given Ed Sullivan in 1959. "I choose my friends based on their character, not their profession." It was never a denial. It was never a confirmation. It was just Frank Sinatra refusing to apologize for the life he'd lived and the men who'd helped him live it. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Ed Sullivan asked the one question everyone told him not to ask, and discovered that some truths come with a price that you have to be willing to pay. Have you ever asked a question you knew was dangerous because not asking it would have been a different kind of danger? Share your story in the comments below.